philosophy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the cruel streets tonight. For Sylvia and Marcia, life was harder than you'll ever know. Still they placed a star where others just threw a stone. Ignited, 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 yeah.
I'm joined today by a very auspicious guest and somebody I've been looking forward to interviewing since I first the name first cropped up on my radar, and that's Kath Brogan, the poet. So, Kath, welcome to Dublin City FM. Welcome to LGBTQ+life.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, Kath, we're going to, later in the programme, we're going to be talking about the inaugural Omagh Pride. But before that, I would like to just get a little bit about your own background. You grew up in Omagh, I gather. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm from a small village called Killyclahar, which is just a mile and a half outside Omagh.
And when I saw something that really struck me, I saw this photograph, and it was in quite a few of the papers, and there you were marching behind a banner at the start of Omagh Pride, and it was rural queers, and I thought I was blown away by that. It reminded me of the Delacroix, Liberty at the Barricades. But what was it like growing up in in rural Northern Ireland? Were you always aware of your orientation, or was that something that came when you moved out like it did with the rest of us?
Well, I think that I always knew that I was attracted to my friends. I remember when like lesbianism came up in Ally McBeal, it was like, ooh, okay. Yeah. And there was definitely some flickers of recognition. But I think I very firmly kind of shoved that side of me back down in a kind of realization that having a boyfriend was definitely a status symbol. And I remember whenever I was in about sort of like 12, 13, and like everybody, I went to an all girls Catholic school, as you can imagine. And a lot of the other girls were all like, had all kissed a boy, and I hadn't kissed a boy. And it sort of felt like this thing that you had to do in order to be cool. And then I ended up kind of being very good friends with guys who would then do very sweet things like write me poems or make me mixtapes. And then I would end up sort of being in a relationship with them when actually we just should have been friends. All the while I was sort of still kind of thinking about women, but it wasn't until I had like kissed a couple of my friends when I was a teenager, but it was always very much couched within a sort of for the titillation of men, or a kind of, doesn't mean anything, but I think it meant more to me than it did to them, basically. And then and it also really, the same thing happened when I went to university. I did join the LGBT group in the first week, and I went to the meeting, and there was like 4 people there in this big empty hall, and 2 of the lesbians looked like super dykey, and I just couldn't see myself in that way. I think because I'm quite a female presenting person, that I didn't really see myself in like the representation of what a lesbian looks like. And I just didn't feel like I identified in that way, because I still really like my clothes and my, I'm quite like a creative person, and I like colorful things. And so I firmly kind of went back into sort of heterosexual again at university, and then it was only when I moved to London that I really came out finally, when I was about 23.
Yeah, you have a very good artistic and particularly a literary reputation. So I'm going to ask you, this is a question I put to other people, is that when you were growing up, did you come across what I would call LGBT literature. You mentioned Ali about Beale, which shows that you're much younger than myself. The one I would refer to as the killing of Sister George. That was the big one in our day. I'm showing my age here now, but when I say to people, the one I learned a lot about LGBT literature from my father. And that's another story in itself. But we had James Baldwin in the house. We had William Burroughs. We had a whole range of LGBT writers. And that's where I first encountered the subject. What was your literary and, shall we say, artistic experience in that sense, Kat?
Yeah, I can't remember like any LGBT writers growing up, certainly not being aware of them. I think for me, growing up in Northern Ireland, my big awareness came around Irish literature, because I always had a very complicated relationship with Irishness, because I associated it with terrorism and general dysfunction and drunkenness and Gaelic football and flute bands and other things that I didn't feel any connection with, and that I felt that they ostracized by these things. So for me, in terms of literary awakening, it was very much about not around being LGBT, but around reading things like Brian Friel's translations and having a greater awareness of what it is to still exist within a colonial context that teaches you to hate yourself and hate where you're from, and that you should be kind of makes you feel like you're lesser than. And I think that was more of an issue for me growing up in Northern Ireland from a Catholic background of not feeling like I connected with the things that were seen as Catholic, and feeling very like rejectionary of anything to do with nationalism. And then books made me get a greater kind of sense of respect for what it is to be Irish.
It's interesting you should say that, Kat, because I'm double your age, and it's, to use a Quentin Tarantino-ism, we park our cars in the same garage. I mean, I was there when I was there before the provisional IRA existed, and I remember that, and I felt exactly the same thing that you talk about. I couldn't wait to leave this country, which I left in 1972, which was just about when the Troubles were kicking off. Can I ask you about one thing, Kat, because I was fascinated. You wrote a poem about the Omagh bombing, and I don't want to labour the Omagh bombing in itself, but I found it a fascinating poem because it struck me that you're from a generation that wasn't part of the Troubles in a way that it was central to, even though I wasn't in Ireland, it was central to my growing up. It was central to a lot of people's identity. What did the Troubles mean to your generation? Is it something that you'd say, well, that happened then, as you say in the poem, it wasn't us, it wasn't, that's not something, or does it have a more visceral meaning for your generation?
I think in Omagh, because we're sort of like 70-30 on the nationalist side, so it's not like other areas where there's maybe, sorry, excuse me, it's not like other areas where either there's like an overwhelming majority of one community or another that results in enclaves, or somewhere where it's maybe a bit more equal. So there's more of a jostling for power. And I think also because Omagh is a rural place, like it's like, everybody eventually is it like, you kind of, your neighbor's your neighbor in a way whenever you live in the middle of nowhere and your nearest neighbor is 2 miles, like it kind of the religion of your neighbor doesn't necessarily come into it. So I feel like Omagh has always been a place that has remained like relatively untouched by sectarianism, in an everyday fashion. And then because like somebody came over the border with a car bomb and set off a bomb on that day, then everybody associates it with the Troubles. When actually, yes, I mean, when I was growing up, we would have helicopters going overhead, or we would have like army in the street, like looking through their sight at you. And after the bomb, we had a lot of bomb scares. So every single week we would have a bomb scare and the town would be closed. And that had a big effect you know, to sort of be sitting there in your uniform in school. And it's like, oh, there's another bomb scare. You have to take the back gate. So it sort of just meant we had to take the back gate, which was slightly longer way around. So I think it's being like, you know, 13 when a massive bomb goes off in your town definitely has like a huge effect on then how you see the world like going forward. And, you know, it does make it real in your life, but it wasn't something that was an everyday, it wasn't something that like caused fear on like an everyday way. And certainly not the same as it would be for, say, people in Belfast or in Derry who are in interface kind of areas. I feel like it's, you know, it's just different when you're from a rural area. And I guess, I mean, the thing about Northern Ireland is that like it's so institutionally segregated. Like I remember going to the library because I wanted to like meet Protestants. And they were like this exotic, like other, you know. So, ooh, the Protestants, you know, like so it was, and like, you know, the games are segregated, the pubs are segregated, the schools are segregated, the churches, so the housing estates. I mean, I remember coming back from my first term in England at university and realizing that like the Catholic housing estates, like the public, you know, the government housing were like flats and they were all in really bad land, where like hilly and stuff like that. Whereas like the Protestant ones were all like lovely, kind of semi-detached, and they all had lovely gardens, and there'd be like a square in the middle with like a play park. And I'm like, hang on a minute, like why does Coronation Cottages look like that and like Mullickmore Heights looks like that, you know? So I think as I get older, I did get a bit more like aware and angry about you know, the fact that like the resources of the Northern Irish state for 50 years were captured to you know, enrich one community and impoverish another. And then we just had another like 50 years of like violence at this point, you know. We are in 2020. It started in 1969. Many would argue we're still living with those legacies. So I think it's more to just do with like growing up in what I would see as a failed state that's existed for 100 years and nobody really knows what to do with.
I'll tell you my anecdote for that one, Kat. My partner is Australian, and when we came back here, we went to let's go across the border, have a look, etc., etc. And they saw, we were going through these small rural villages and whatever, small towns, and they said, isn't this lovely? Oh, the pavements were painted, and the letterbox were painted, and the telephone boxes were painted. And I said, yes. And when we get halfway through, they'll suddenly go from green, white, and orange to red, white, and blue. And you and I knew what that meant. They didn't. And it's, I suppose, in many respects, it's those symbolisms that, to many extents, sum it up. Here's one for you there, Kath. When I was about, I think I was about 26, and this is why your experience there was in Northern Ireland. Mine was in London, because I lived in London pretty much the entire 70s, from 72 to 1980, before I left to go to Australia. And I have no qualms about admitting this. I was arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, not because I associated with people or I was involved. I wasn't. I was a hippie. You know, we smoked dope. That's what we did. And I was arrested because, as I say, I was in possession of an Irish accent. Did you ever experience, you know, your generation, it was post Belfast, Good Friday Agreement, whatever people want to call it. Did you ever come across any of that discrimination in the UK?
My second week in it, no, not even my second day in England. I was on the roof of my dorm smoking something. Yeah. And there was another fella there who was, you know, happy to smoke as well. And then he was like, he sort of just like switched to me. He was like, are you Catholic or Protestant? And I was like, I'm atheist. Like, I don't care. I'm neither. Like, I want to get away from that stuff. Like, I'm not interested. But he really pushed me, you know, he's really like, are you Catholic or Protestant? Catholic or Protestant? And I was like, well, my family's Catholic. And then he got right up in my face and was like, you guys are effing murderers. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that was like, so it was so shocking for me. Like it had this, and it had a really profound effect on me that actually made me quite like angry. And then I also had another time where I got stopped by the police for going around the roundabout the wrong way on campus, if you know what I mean. Because and then he was like, he fined me, and then when he heard my accent, he was like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "I'm in New York." And then he was like, "Where are your parents from?" And then he was like, "I'm going to put you on the security database." And I used to get it like when I was on the train and stuff a lot. What would happen actually was because where I was in York was very army, very big army barracks there. So I would get ex-army people. I remember once being on this train and this guy being like, I was just talking on my phone to my friend, so obviously he heard the accent, and then he was like, "You don't know what it was like." He was like screaming at me like on the train carriage. So there was definitely some very weird times like that. And I mean, really, that's what my Omagh poem is about. It's not really about what, it's about how other people react to you because of how they see your town, because of this global news event that happened in the town, you know. And sort of people's like awkwardness around the Troubles, and also like England's trauma. Like England is so like doesn't even know what to do about the Troubles. Like there's a lot of people there who, I mean, maybe less so now. This is like the early 2000s that I'm talking about. So you know, I'm already like 20 years out of date, but certainly at that time there was still a lot of people in England who had served in Northern Ireland. And there was like there's a lot of trauma there in terms of probably just not even knowing how to deal with what this conflict even meant. Like, what did their time here even mean? Like, what was that all about, you know?
Can I ask you then the pointed question, because this is something I used to do up to about a year ago. I was doing a political program, and I particularly aimed this at one party, and, you know, no prizes for guessing which one. And I say, 35 years of slaughter, was it worth it? What's your perception on that one? I mean, it didn't bring about a united Ireland. It didn't it didn't eliminate the British presence. You know, when you see what we have now, and most of that was achieved without firing a bullet. What's your thoughts on that, Kath? And I'm not trying to put you...
No, I mean, I'm like a resolutely non-violent person. I don't think that like violence actually brings forward the case of human rights in many instances. Like I feel from my reading of the Troubles, from my GCSE history or whatever, is that, you know, so much more was achieved in terms of Catholic emancipation before the Troubles started, rather than, you know, through the violent struggle by the IRA. But I think what you also have to look at is the actions of where people were being burnt out of their homes, where there was basically a kind of, you know, and you could basically kill or whatever, you could do whatever you wanted to a Catholic with impunity. And a lot of what we saw in the, you know, the 70s, 80s and 90s was a reaction to like, you know, 50 years of being put in your box. So I don't think that I can necessarily judge somebody who lost someone because of like British Army actions or B Specials actions or RUC actions, or lost their house, for that person to then decide, I'm going to go join the IRA. Like, I don't think I can judge that person because that never happened to me. So I can't imagine what that's like. And I think like whenever you're looking at the slaughter, you can't just look at what some angry 17-year-old male did, because, you know, on either side, whether it's an angry 17-year-old army fella or UVF fella or Sinn Féin fella or IRA fella or whoever, because they are 17-year-old men and 17-year-old boys, and 17-year-old boys will do what 17-year-old boys do, which is like break stuff and mess stuff up. And really, where does the responsibility lie? To me, it lies with, you know, the institutions that are supposed to be there, like making sure people have equal access to housing, equal access to infrastructure, equal access to healthcare, schooling, you know, all those things. Like that is where like not with like some kids who are like, yeah, let's go shoot stuff and blow stuff up. Like if you give a boy a chance to do that, he's going to do that. Like,
yeah. So can I ask you, and this is coming somewhat more up to date, what was your reaction when you saw the tragic circumstances of Lyra McKee? Because that only, I appreciate it was probably accidental that she wasn't targeted, but did you feel a personal wound to a certain degree?
Massively, yeah. I mean, I did what I tend to do whenever I experience trauma, which is write a poem about it.
Yeah.
You know, and I was in Kuala Lumpur at the time, and it yeah, it was awful because it really felt like here's, you know, a young gay woman who's decided to move to Derry, you know, to be with a partner who's being part of politics in the north. And here's someone who hasn't gone away, you know. And I feel like I've been trying to get back to Northern Ireland my whole life, my whole adult life, that I've left it. And but what's always held me back is like, well, I'd have to do something about the terrible state of politics in my country. And that's too hard, and it's too depressing, and it's too upsetting. And here's someone who had the guts to stay and make her voice heard among all the viciousness and among all the pain and the hurt and trauma, and she's been shot for like no reason. You know, it would almost be better if she was targeted, like, because it's just I mean, that's the whole problem with violence, is like the randomness of it and the indiscriminateness and the collateral damage and the people who are caught in the crossfire. So it's like this pointlessness, you know.
All I will say is that most people can't understand this, and I think when we talk about your work in a school in the East End of London, I would defy anybody to have their door broken down at 3 o'clock in the morning, like happened to me, with 15 armed police officers come through your door in London and not be radicalised. That's all I could say is that, of course, you're going to feel sympathy for the side that's under attack. Tell me, Catherine, you call your email is poet. When did you decide you wanted to be a poet, and what was your influences that formulated that or formed that?
Well, Facebook has just reminded me actually that on this day 11 years ago, I became a full-time poet. I quit my job and decided to focus on my poeting. And I mean, I've always written, I've always performed my whole life. I started off at the Sesh when I was 6 years old, doing poetry readings, and then I always wrote. And then when I was at university, I had a little poetry club. We did some poetry shows. And then I was also part of like a sound system. And I used to like MC to hip hop and drum and bass and stuff. And we put on these big club nights and stuff and get DJs up from London and things like that. And then when I was in Belfast, I found that there wasn't like a massive kind of like hip hop scene, or there wasn't that much like going on in terms of like the rap stuff. And then I got more into the poetry stuff in Belfast. And then when I went to London, I had a bit of a difficult experience with the rapping thing. It just felt a little bit like I was way too like, I wasn't like I wasn't what they expected from a rapper. And I find it like too aggressive and stuff, and not like really kind of intellectual enough for me. So and also with poetry, it was nice because you could just go and you could sign up and you got 3 minutes. Whereas with the MC stuff, you had to really fight for the mic. So I got more and more into the spoken word, and I was working at the Fair Trade Foundation, and I was interested in like co-ops and social enterprises. I'd spent some summers in Kenya. So I really thought like I was going to go down the sort of international development kind of route. But I got more and more disenchanted with like the sort of what I see as like the neo-colonial global project that masquerades itself as international development, and a feeling that it was just sort of a neo-missionary kind of agenda that was there to kind of make the medicine go down with global corporate capitalism. So I decided like it wasn't really my massive calling. And meanwhile, like the poetry stuff was getting better and better. So I was on Radio 4 representing London in the UK Poetry Slam. I got some, and then I got this job doing like poetry workshops in the Florence Nightingale Museum as part of the Cultural Olympiad. And they paid me quite well. So I was like, oh, okay, so maybe this is like a thing that I can do. This could be my job. And also I was living in a squat. I was living in Balham Bowling Club. So I was able to, I didn't have to pay rent, and I was eating from bins, and I was riding a bike. So I didn't really have many outgoings. So it seemed like, and also it was like, after the crash in 2008, I mean, I was only like out of university 1 year when that happened. So early on in my career, there was this massive financial crash that meant that job security wasn't really a thing anymore anyway. So I was like, well, I might as well be a poet, like squatting, eating from bins, riding my bike. Like, why not? And sort of, and a friend of mine really was what it was. She was like, forget this fair trade stuff, just focus on being, just see what you can do with it, see where it goes. And she really gave me permission to do it, because before that, like, I didn't think that like being an artist or being a writer and a performer was something that like I was necessarily allowed to do. Yeah. Seemed like it was something for, like, I didn't really know anybody who did that, or it wasn't something that seemed like that was viable. And so that was really important to have my friend tell me that to give me that permission.
Sure. You taught at a school, as I said earlier, I think it was called Lammas in East London. What I could see is that largely is a school made up of children of ethnic minorities. Was that something that you gravitated towards, or was it something that just happened along the way? And if I could ask a supplementary question is, did you find a certain resonance with your own experience and their experience?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Kenya when I was at university, and I also had a pen pal from Kenya when I was like a child. So I've always been really in, and I had uncles who'd been in Uganda and also been in various other parts of Africa. So I'd always had this interest from very young childhood in Africa in general, and also in like cultures outside my own. I think growing up in such a like mono culture, like where you couldn't even interact with the Protestants, well, I mean, you were asking me about feeling an affinity with the mostly ethnic minorities, the migrant community that I was a poet in residence in a school in East London, and it was actually 25% Eastern European, and then there was a large and then the only people who were British were the people with the Irish surnames. So I had like the Kellys, and there was like 13 Kellys. So there was like a different Kelly in each year. It was like Matthew Kelly, Grace Kelly. So there was also quite a large Irish population there in that area. Along with, we had a lot of people from the Caribbean, Somalia, Middle East, Yemen, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, really everywhere. And I think I definitely was able to relate to them on a level of what it's like to be othered when you arrive in England. And although, of course, I have this line, it's like, that it's sort of, physically, I look like I'm English, but whenever you open your mouth, you kind of reveal yourself. Yeah. So I think that was certainly something that a lot of my Eastern European students would have experienced as well. And it's almost like quite a surprise, because in a way you sort of don't necessarily expect to be so othered whenever you go to England, as a, you know, especially for me, as I sort of always considered that I'd grown up in the UK. I was very strongly like, I'm a UK person. And then when I got to England, they were like, no, you're definitely Irish. And I'd be like, Northern Irish. And they'd be like, Irish, you're Irish. So in many ways, I never really felt as Irish as when I went to England. And I definitely did tap into a lot of those experiences when I was working with my students who, but I was also very aware of the fact that I am middle class. My dad was lucky enough to go to university with the grant. And although my mother's disabled and she wasn't able to work, we did, you know, I had a comfortable upbringing where we had books in the house and regular meal times, and everything was quite calm and orderly. Whereas many of my students had very chaotic lives. They lived in many different countries. Many of them were missing their family back home. A lot of them were recently arrived, had very little English. So I think as well as being aware of a kind of current of a sort of like a timbre of what it must feel like for them, I also tried to remain conscious of the extent of my privilege. And it really reminded me of how lucky I was to have been parented quite obsessively, whereas many of my students weren't lucky enough to have that.
Sure. Well, I want to commend a video that's on YouTube to all our listeners called Cold as Ices. And I noticed in the credits there's a video camera credit given to a Miss Brogan. It's a great expression. It's a great video. It's a very poignant video. It's a very poignant message.
Yeah.
Did you come up with the term cold as ices, or did they do that themselves?
That was my student. I can't take credit for that at all. I still vividly remember being in the canteen, and the year before we'd made a poetry video about homophobia. And that had come from the teachers, because we were a Stonewall school. And then we'd done one about food waste. And again, it had come from sort of this UN competition thing, and other people wanted to do something about food waste. And then the kids came to me that third year and were like, the thing in it, it had just happened in Paris. I can't remember if it was the Charlie Hebdo or the mass shooting. And there had just been somebody in close to us in Leighton who'd been sort of some kind of attack in the underground. And my students who were Muslim came to me and were like, we really feel like we're just treated like we're terrorists all the time. We want to write about this. We want to make a music video. And I was like, yes, do it. I totally recognize what it's like whenever people just associate you with terrorism and how upsetting that is. Let's do it, you know. So that was definitely something I could relate to. And it did make me think about, you know, the experience of Irish people in England in, you know, in the 70s and 80s and what that was like. And my own experience of being kind of like minimized and caricatured as like just a terrorist. And I think for these, especially because they were young boys, and they just absolutely, like, I'll be honest, the first rapper, I did help him out a wee bit, but the second guy, it's 100% him. He was amazing. And then we had this school trip to the House of Parliament, and I was like, okay, this is the perfect opportunity. So like on the bus, I was like, okay, do the rap. On the train, I was like, do the rap. And then we were in the House of Parliament. Of course, you're not allowed to film in the House of Parliament. So I was just kind of surreptitiously, you know, catching little bits and stuff. So I'm so glad that we did it. But actually what happened was, I think it would have gone a lot more viral. They wanted us on the news, on the TV news and stuff. But then the father of the student didn't agree with his son doing music.
Okay.
So we kind of had to, we had to sort of hold it down a bit. But I'm still glad that we made it. I think it was and he has gone on to do more music. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, it's called Cold as Ices. Let everybody look it up, because it's 4 minutes of magic, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I am very proud of it.
Yeah. Kat, let's move on. And this is something I would be very interested to hear your view on. Today has been designated International what is it? International Coming Out Day. And I thought to myself,
Yeah.
this is a bit like Debs for the LGBT community. I suspect you didn't have a coming out experience in that sense of the word. I certainly didn't. What do you feel about that?
About coming out day.
Yeah, having a coming out day in itself.
I mean, I think like, what would you, well, I'm not exactly sure what it's for. Like, would you wait until that day and only on that day you can come out? I don't know. Or, I mean, I guess it's like any of these days, right? It's all just about raising awareness, which is important and useful. I mean, I think that there's almost like, I feel like there's a little bit of like too many days. I feel like there's fatigue about days. Like no matter about LGBT or not, I feel like there's too many days. But I mean, you know, yeah,
helps,
I guess.
suppose,
what do I feel about coming out?
No. The coming out's fine.
Or,
or even coming out in itself. I mean, I suspect you didn't sit the Brogans down one day and said, "Guess what? I'm going to wear sensible shoes." I mean,
well, I mean, I think it should more accurately be coming out days, or that you're coming out all the time. You're always coming out.
Oh, sure, you do that every day.
Yeah, and yeah, for me it was like I told my dad first, and then I told my siblings, and then I told my mom, you know, and so it was much more, it wasn't like I told them all at the same time or anything. And then of course, you know, I'm someone who is like always assumed to be heterosexual. So there's always that little moment where I have to, where if say I'm talking about my partner and then they'll say he, and then I have to correct the pronouns or whatever, you know.
Yeah, well, my coming out experience, I will tell you here and now. Paul McCartney told the world that he took LSD, and I thought that's a great thing. So I went in home and I told my mother. She immediately brought in the psychiatrist, and I thought, that's it. Honesty is overrated. And I just went off and became who I am, and that's that. But let's talk about the main focus today. Omagh Pride. You were one of the organisers. You were there at the very front of the march. How important was Omagh Pride on a macro level to the area and personal level to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big day. There was a lot of emotions. I mean, to see the town so full of people. And it was a really intergenerational day, which I really loved about it, because I think you have to remember with the rural area, you usually do find that the 18 to 40s are kind of bottomed out. They're sort of hollowed out, and it's all, you know, under 18s and over 60s. So it was so wonderful to see that compared to other prides I've been in big cities, that it was very much like the whole family had come out and all the kids were all rainbowed up, you know. And I was talking to some ladies in their 70s who'd like got their nails done, especially in rainbows, you know, and they were just delighted. So I feel like it had a real family vibe to it, that it was really about, you know, parents whose LGBT children don't live in Omagh anymore came, you know, or people came back to Omagh. And somebody said to me, I've never been so excited about coming down the road to Omagh, you know. And that was really special. And it was just really joyous. And also it was super cross community, because a lot of times like marches are either like St. Patrick's Day or the Orange March. And then it's like those are super one community or the other. And they have all these trappings that are very uncomfortable, even if you are from that community. So it was really lovely to see something that really cut across like age, religion, and sexuality. You know, it was very much like something that allies could get involved with as well and could get behind, which was something that we also really wanted, because of course, like, we have to remember we are the minority. So there's just not necessarily like enough queer people in Omagh anyway. So it was so wonderful to have something that was an opportunity for allies as well to get involved. And I think that's the lovely thing about a Pride parade, is that compared to say like a club night or whatever, it is something that that everyone can get behind.
As I said at the beginning of this talk, the expression on your face is just Fabulous. It's not triumphalist. It's almost like affirmation and acceptance. Was that the feeling you had on the day?
Yeah, I think like growing up in Omagh, I never would have imagined that I would have felt comfortable walking down my high street with my same-sex partner. And doing Pride, it like showed that like we're not there, and we're not there anymore. Like it's not the 90s anymore. Like we have moved on. Yeah. And there was like a lot of healing around that. And I remember growing up, like how badly bullied my schoolmate was for being gay when we were in primary school, and we didn't even know what gay was, but we knew he was gay, and we knew that that was a reason to torture the poor fella. And I know that like when I was 16, like I had a choice to be with like a woman instead of my boyfriend, and I chose my boyfriend because that was the easy thing to do. And I wonder about like how my life would have been different if I had have made that choice when I was 16 rather than waiting another 7 years to have the bravery to do that. So it was wonderful to see so many young kids there. Like there was real young teenagers there, which was so beautiful because the difference that's going to make for them. But it was also really like I was chatting to one guy who he started off in the march and he had to go home. It was like too much for him. He said like he felt guilty about it, but he felt angry because of all the hurt and of all the pain for so long, for so many decades. And then seeing these young kids being like all able to experience this Pride parade at Omagh, it sort of felt like, oh, if only this had have been my reality when I was a teenager. So there was a lot of emotions. It was so emotional because I think, the thing is that when you're from a small town, you're not just yourself. Like those old 70-year-old ladies with their nails painted, they were chatting to me about my granny's toffee apples. Yeah. And my granny's toffee apples stopped being sold in 1965. But you wouldn't imagine the amount of people who remember her toffee apples and will describe them in detail for ages. So you're not just yourself. You are your family name. You are your grandparents. You are your siblings. Like everybody's so kind of interlinked and interwoven. And it's a kind of generational thing as well. So it's so much more like closer to the heart than walking through like a big city where even if you're from Belfast, even if you're from Dublin, that is a certain experience of anonymity. Whereas when you're in a rural town, there's no anonymity.
Yeah. Well, if it's any consolation, Kat, what you mentioned about your, shall we say, perception of what Irishness was, and I felt exactly the same growing up 30 or 40 years earlier. The day that changed it all for me was a day in May in 2015. I was there in Dublin Castle when we counted the votes for marriage equality. And that's the first time I have ever seen a mass outbreak of joy. Joy is a very complex emotion. And I thought to myself, the Ireland I always wanted has come home. And that has changed it since then for me. And I suspect Omagh Pride did something similar for yourself.
Totally. I mean, I've been like all over the world. I've organized gay stuff in London, in Kuala Lumpur. I set up an LGBT social center with my partner and we were running LGBT events there. And it gave me this opportunity to carve out a queer community in the place that I'm from. Yeah. And, I think also because like for me, because my mom's disabled, and that's a big part of me being home is that my mom can't really travel. She can't come to me. I have to go to her, which means that I have to keep coming back to Omagh. And I think for a lot of people, certainly when they're as their parents age, that, you don't want to have to make this choice between like being yourself or being with your family. And you want to be able to feel like, I mean, when you're from Omagh, it's more of it's the socioeconomic factors are never something you can get away from. There simply isn't much to be getting on with here in terms of making a living. but at least by, you know, but I also feel like it's a self-perpetuating circle, like, because everybody leaves. Like, we have so many wonderful people from Omagh. We've my next door neighbor is a amazing female film director who's working with Ben Stiller at the moment. My other guys, like from Omagh, Radio 1 DJ, like there's so many people who've done amazing things, but not in Omagh. So I think for me, it was to have the opportunity to do something in Omagh was really powerful.
Yeah. Kat, you've been fabulous with your time. You've been very patient with my dodgy internet. You have not disappointed me. I look forward to speaking to you, and you have been a revelation. You're a breath of fresh air. With a bit of luck, we might be able to get to Omagh Pride next year. So keep up that great work. Look, there's a new Ireland out there, and as I say to people, this is our legacy to the next generation, and it's something we can be both proud of. So Kat Brogan, you be safe, stay safe, and stay fabulous, because you are.
Oh, thank you. So lovely to chat with you today, and thanks for all the work that you're doing with the show.
Not at all. You take care.
Friends with Dorothy come out off the sidewalk and onto the street to the sound of those legendary feet. When there's no place like home, anti-him, anti-establishment, with the chaff and the short straw, they'll have a stuff for sure. Anti-him, I'm anti-establishment. They took my name and the clothes I own. They broke our hearts, but not our souls.